Hello and welcome to UPLINK TV Video Game History Series. Today we're talking about the 5th generation of video game consoles.
What?
My name is Brendan Bailey.
And I'm Mike Staub.
And we're going to kick things off talking about the Atari Jaguar.
Oh yeah.
So you might be confused, like I was when I first saw one of these and thought that this was a CD tray system here, but it's not. It actually is a cartridge-based system. And look, they even give you a little handle to hold the games with. I mean, I assume that that's what that is, right? It's a little handle for the cartridge.
It makes it easier to put the cartridge and pull the cartridge out of the system because that's so difficult to do. The Atari Jaguar is interesting because at this point in time when the Atari Jaguar came out, we were dealing with the 16-bit generation. We had the Genesis and the Super Nintendo kind of at the forefront of the 16-bit console war. So Jaguar and Atari decided to not give us a 32-bit console, but to jump another 32 bits and give us a 64-bit console. And the first 64-bit console...
Or so they claim.
So they claim. The first 64-bit console on the market. And the CPU in the Jaguar uses the same CPU in the Sega Genesis. So that means that a lot of ports were common between the Sega Genesis and the Atari Jaguar. I just think that the Atari Jaguar is kind of in this lost place in terms of video game consoles in history.
Yeah, I remember arguing with someone whether or not the Jaguar was truly a 64-bit console or if the N64 was the first 64-bit console, because those are the things we all argued about as kids, right? Like which system was better, and I remember this one guy like really giving me a hard time saying that the Jaguar was the future and it was going to be the first 64-bit console and it was going to destroy all the other game consoles and nobody knows it yet, but this was going to be such a big deal. Anyway, he was the only person I ever met probably until the last 5 years of my life that had a Jaguar or really liked the Jaguar. Yeah, I mean, it's... Look, the Jaguar is another one of those systems where they were caught between doing 2D games and 3D games. There's some 2D games and there's some 3D games. And the 3D games were definitely a lot more primitive than even, say, the N64 standards. Yeah. And probably my biggest complaint with the Jaguar was this controller, which is just kind of like a giant telephone-looking thing.
Yeah, nice number pad, man.
Yeah, I don't know much to say about it other than it's big, it's got all those buttons on there. I believe some games came with little cards like to add on to the controller so you could see what each button did for the game, which is kind of an idea that dates back to the Intellivision, ColecoVision days where they did stuff like that on the game's controller, and the games had number pads on the controllers.
Overlays.
Just way too complicated.
Yeah, you look at that thing and that just... It gives me a little bit of a headache looking at that controller. I mean, I understand that the Jaguar has its place in history as something that was touting that it was the first 64-bit console. Unfortunately for the Jaguar, it really wasn't successful, and ultimately that game division got bought out by Hasbro and kind of, they shut down the gaming division that was working on the Jaguar, which has opened up the Jaguar to some really great homebrew stuff in this modern era. But I think what we probably should talk about with the Jaguar next is look at its unique design. Have you seen that somewhere else before?
This shape, this actual plastic mold, became kind of like a public domain design after, I guess, Hasbro decided to not maintain any sort of copyright protection on the shape of the Jaguar itself. And so this plastic piece ended up being used in like various pieces of medical equipment. You can see the exact same Jaguar shell, and some game collectors actually try to get a hold of those pieces of equipment just to say that they have all the Jaguar-inspired designs, appliance designs that are out there. Another interesting thing about the Jaguar is that there's actually a very rare CD peripheral that was added that does sit in this cutout. Which leads me to believe that Atari really did plan to make the peripheral from the beginning, because it has a very deliberate cutout where if you don't have the game cartridge in here, you can slot this CD peripheral add-on that goes into the cartridge slot and sits right on top of here. Unfortunately, those units are very notorious for not working right. So much so that they have been given the nickname the toilet bowl because it kind of looks like a giant toilet seat and also doesn't work. So,
well, that's the Jaguar for you, and it was a noble attempt.
We were kind of harsh on our review, but I mean, like, if you're interested in an offbeat system, I mean, there are some decent games for it.
Absolutely.
The Raiden game, Tempest 2000. I mean, there's some stuff to fool around with.
And then we can move on a little bit further to Sega's foray into CD gaming, CD-ROM-based gaming, with the excellent and underloved Sega Saturn. I love the Sega Saturn. I think the Sega Saturn is a great system. This came out in 1994, and it was a powerhouse for 2D gaming. The Sega Saturn really had some wonderful 2D side-scrolling shooters, top-down shooters, great 2D fighting games. And as someone who plays a lot of Sega Saturn all the time, I really appreciate what this system was. And it was a CD-based console, so it's one of the first real, true standalone CD consoles.
Yeah, I think the Sega Saturn was the victim of some bad timing, especially in the American market, because there was such a major push towards 3D games. Everything had to be 3D. Americans were demanding 3D games. Everybody was becoming all obsessed with, polygon graphics and all that stuff. And here you have the Saturn, which was pretty much one of the best two-dimensional game systems. So, to remedy this, Sega kind of slapped on some processors on there to try to, give it some 3D horsepower. But it really, from its core, didn't really have the 3D capabilities from the get-go. And so I think sales and the reception kind of suffered because of that, especially in America. Nowadays, though, the Saturn is has kind of a resurgence.
Yeah.
A lot of people are really kind of realizing, hey, this was an amazing system. There's a lot of amazing Japanese games available for the system. One of the things that you can do nowadays is get a hold of what's known as an action replay cartridge. This system actually does have a cartridge slot on it in addition to the CD unit. And these cartridges will allow you to play games from other regions. It'll increase the RAM of the system, acts as a memory card, and does a whole bunch of interesting enhancements. And they still make these cartridges now, so you can still get a hold of them, and they're not very expensive.
No, they're not. You can actually get them on eBay relatively inexpensively, and like Brendan says, it really gives you access to quite the library. The issue that you run into with the Sega Saturn is that the games, the United States released games for Sega Saturn, are incredibly expensive. Very, very expensive, but importing Japanese games isn't that bad. And with an action replay cart, you can play the Japanese games natively on the American Sega Saturn. So you can get access to some really great stuff, especially if you're really into fighting games and shooters, which if you don't speak Japanese or read it very well, you can play with really no problem.
Yep. Yeah, I think Sega was going through a little bit of turmoil with all the add-ons that they were making for the Sega Genesis. The Saturn was supposed to be like their next major breakthrough success, and I don't think it was the success that Sega really wanted. I think it was another situation where more successful in Japan than it was in America. But like I said, it's kind of gaining a kind of a cult notoriety now, and I wouldn't refer to it as like an obscure console.
No.
But it definitely wasn't as prominent as the PlayStation and N64 that we'll discuss next.
Also, the Sega Saturn controller is excellent for 2D fighting games or fighting games in general. The 6-button layout is wonderful. If you go ahead and play games like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter or X-Men vs. Street Fighter, you're getting very arcade-accurate versions of those games on a home console, which continues with Sega's kind of pedigree from the 90s of wanting to bring the arcade experience home, and the Sega Saturn was great at that. Some excellent games that stand out for the Sega Saturn. Obviously, I've named a couple of fighting games, but I would go with Panzer Dragoon, which is amazing, which is a really nice on-rail shooter, something to compete with Star Fox that would come out in the N64 or the Super Nintendo. And I'm a huge fan of games like Street Fighter Alpha 1, 2, and 3 are all on the Sega Saturn. I'm also a big fan of Radiant Silvergun, which is a wonderful shooter that you can get on Saturn. Really great stuff and really great arcade-accurate ports. I also will always suggest Elevator Action Returns if you don't mind selling a lung to get it.
Yeah, also with the Saturn was the Sega Netlink modem that was kind of like an early, really pioneer of playing games online. We kind of forget the use of internet in those early days of the 90s. I mean, we had things like the the Sega Channel and that sort of thing, but online gaming was still strictly kind of like a PC thing, and it was slowly creeping its way into the consoles. And the Netlink modem was probably one of the biggest leaps forward for online gaming for consoles.
All right, so now we gotta roll over to the champion of the generation here, the newcomer as well, right? It's hard to be Rookie of the Year and also win the World Series, but the Sony PlayStation kind of did that in 1994. So this was born out of a failed attempt to make a add-on to the Super Nintendo. Sony said, screw it all, we're gonna make our own system. Oh, I almost quoted Bender. We're gonna make our own system, and it's going to be a CD-based system, and it's going to be amazing, and rightfully so. I think if most people of our age who won't tell you the Super Nintendo is their favorite console of all time, a lot of those people will tell you the Sony PlayStation is. It feels like from generation to generation, the Sony PlayStation really carried that torch. It has everything that you can ask for in a console, every genre, every gameplay style, 3D games, 2D games. It's amazing. I love the Sony PlayStation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the fact that Nintendo kind of haphazardly gave birth to one of its biggest competitors when they decided to not move forward with the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, and Sony decided to just create this product on its own. One of the things that over the years that I've realized is that the PlayStation, just from a design standpoint, was very modern for the time, and I don't think I really appreciated that back in the day.
Yeah.
I didn't really pay much attention to the PlayStation when it first came out. I think CD-ROM stuff I still always associated it with more of kind of those interactive games or the full motion video games, and when I saw another console that was CD-based, I didn't really take it seriously at first. I thought it was going to be another game library similar to the Sega CD or something like the CDI or those kinds of products that were out there. And it really wasn't until all the buzz around Final Fantasy VII that my brother and I really looked into the PlayStation and said, "Oh man, I think we got to get one of these. This console is serious. There's some pretty amazing games on this." And that ended up being a wonderful decision, and really exposing me to a whole new world of genres, RPG games and 3D games that really hadn't experienced yet. I think that the PS1 has one of the largest libraries, especially for systems from the 90s.
I mean, if you wanted to get a console that could really give you, like I said, everything, platformers, RPGs, sports games, fighting games, racing games, shooters, everything. Everything's on the PlayStation. Runs the full gamut. Also, the CD-based technology allowed Sony to put CD quality audio on the games, so you got better music and you got better audio, and they could do their own FMVs, which are famous in the instances of Resident Evil. But it's a console that kind of has since become synonymous with gaming. I feel like in a lot of ways it kind of took over from what Nintendo was at that point in time of being a Nintendo is a video game console, and a PlayStation now is something that kind of has become like a generic term almost for what video gaming is. And it does so much, and it has so many great games. It's got a vast library. The CD games were less expensive than their cartridge competitors, and Sony even learned how to learn from Nintendo with the analog stick and created their own DualShock controller that had vibrate built in with dual analog sticks, which at the time the N64 had the single analog stick, and you would have to buy a separate add-on for rumble. So the PlayStation kind of took from the soup of creativity and did quite a lot of stuff with what they had.
The interesting thing about the PlayStation controller also is that this design with the dual joysticks essentially is unchanged to this day. They're not all compatible with each other, but the general button layout and the joystick layout, even with the PlayStation 5 coming out, the design, the overall layout of the controller is basically the same. I think it's just a testament to how well designed that controller was at the time, and pretty remarkable when you see the wildly different controllers that Nintendo has put out over the years, whether the the 3-prong N64 controller or the Wiimote, all these wildly different designs. PlayStation has just basically said, our DualShock controller is perfect the way it is. We'll just keep putting it out like that.
And it really revolutionized things with having 2 analog sticks on a controller. Now, they're not offset, which I know a lot of folks who like to play video games, especially shooters and things like that, they don't like that about the DualShock. But the DualShock was kind of one of the first consoles to really champion the analog stick, and it's kind of created history.
Yeah. Also worth noting that with PlayStation's CD-based architecture and the fact that it was a pretty powerful system, you had a lot of the major publishers kind of move away from Nintendo, who opted for cartridge-based games, and they said, hey, we want to make games on CD. So most notably would be Squaresoft, which was making some of the best RPG games at the time for Super Nintendo, decided to jump ship and produce, continue their RPG franchises on PlayStation instead of Nintendo. And strictly from a media standpoint, like they just wanted that extra, the capabilities that the CD unit gave them that they couldn't do on cartridge.
Well, you gotta think too, so many of the key franchises, third-party franchises that were on Nintendo consoles and synonymous with Nintendo consoles previously moved over to PlayStation and away from the N64. We're talking Final Fantasy, we're talking Dragon Quest, we're talking Metal Gear, Castlevania, Mega Man. These are all series that moved away from Nintendo in this era because it was so much more appealing to make games on CD. And we saw that, and Nintendo, unfortunately, with the N64, though it's a console that many people love, the N64 did not perform as well as the PlayStation. The PlayStation was a juggernaut.
Yeah, and I think, at least in my case, I think that was a major factor in wanting to buy one of these, is to see, hey, I want to play Mega Man X4.
Yeah.
Why can't I play that on a Nintendo console? Oh, I can only play it on this. Okay, and then eventually Saturn. But yeah, I mean, the PS1, I think, is probably my favorite PlayStation.
Yep.
I definitely am a fan of Sony. I really stopped playing favorites when it came to game makers. I think that was something I did as a kid, and I would argue for my favorite console. But as I grew older, I kind of realized that hey, let's just try to enjoy this stuff, I don't see the need to be like a fanboy, get the console that you like and play it, but all right, I guess
that's the PlayStation, and now we
do we want to talk about the good Nintendo console, or do we want to talk about the bad one?
I think we got to get the bad news out of the way first.
All right, let's get the bad news out of the way first.
So, designed and developed by Gunpei Yokoi, the wonderful gentleman who gave us the Game Boy, comes this Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was Nintendo's idea to, somehow take a step into virtual reality. But when I say virtual reality, I mean weird 90s red vector graphics. Virtual reality. It's an interesting console, and to be completely honest with you, to show you how successful it was, or maybe to show you how unsuccessful it was, this is the entire United States library for the Virtual Boy. This is it. It's like, I'm not going to count them, but it's not a lot of games. Not a lot of games for this thing. And while I do think it has a great place, place in history. There's something, the Virtual Boy just never caught on. I think only 1 million units sold.
I gotta be honest, and I'm gonna completely come clean here. I was kind of hyped for the Virtual Boy when it was announced, and I saw some of the early footage. I thought it looked cool. The fact that the games were in red really didn't bother me, because it just looked like something unique and different, which may have been what Nintendo was really going for. But my brother and my family really didn't feel the same enthusiasm that I did, and we ended up doing the only time that this ever happened when I was a kid. We ended up renting a Virtual Boy. I'm sure a lot of people probably remember that you could rent a Virtual Boy from Blockbuster, and it would come in like this giant plastic black case that was like Virtual Boy branded, and you could just rent the system. And I have a feeling a lot of people did that, and then when they got it home, they realized, this isn't something we need to buy. It's worth the rental, but I don't think it's worth buying. The Virtual Boy gave a lot of people headaches. It wasn't easy to play. You had to contort your neck in a strange way to get your eyes into these eye sockets to see the screens inside here. Nintendo did give you a strap where you could actually strap this whole unit to your head.
Oh, that sounds like
but the unit is just too big and too bulky to do that comfortably, and it would end up hurting you. It was just, and if you looked in there for too long, it would give you headaches and hurt your eyes, and just it wasn't a pleasant gaming experience. It was an interesting idea, and you're kind of ahead of its time in terms of like trying to create a virtual reality system, like similar to what we have now. But I think it was just too soon. It was too limited. It wasn't comfortable. I don't think the form factor was fully thought out, and it ended up being like really Nintendo's only major failure of a game console.
It's definitely something that has become part of history that's looked fondly upon, at least to a degree, because of it being part of Nintendo's robust video game history.
Yep.
But it does also run the risk of overheating sometimes. We've had it at the Expo every year, and it gets played a lot, but sometimes it runs into issues where it needs to be shut off for a while, probably because you're not supposed to play it that long, or you'll burn your eyes out of your head.
Yep.
Luckily, though, for us today, there's a lot of very talented people on the internet who take units like these and actually make them into consoles that you can plug them into some sort of TV or monitor. So if you want to experience the Virtual Boy library without, seeing only red for the rest of your life, you can actually get a really cool consoleized version of this, and many of them change the color scheme so that you can play games in black and white. Some of these games are really great. There's a Wario Land game on here that's very good. There's the first appearance of Shin Megami Tensei with Jack Bros, or Jack Brothers, on the Virtual Boy. So there's some really interesting stuff happening here.
Yep.
And what is really great about the Virtual Boy is it's not that its controller is great, but if you look at the controller, you'll see that there are two D-pads on it. So this is kind of like a precursor to a dual analog controller. And you could see how having two D-pads could really affect how you could play the game and turn the camera and do things like that. And I think that this was an idea that was ultimately revisited later by pretty much every game console on the planet, of having these two different D-pads, or which would eventually turn into, I think, two different.
Yeah, the controller is actually one of my favorite parts about the Virtual Boy. I just like the design of it. I think it looks cool. I think it's very comfortable, and I think it probably played a role in getting Nintendo away from like the kind of oval-shaped or boxy-shaped controllers that they had used on the NES and the Super NES, and was a good transition into the the wacky, wild world of the N64 controller.
Yeah, it's time to play it loud. So I think Nintendo always likes to do that, right? They always like to bring in concepts and ideas that they had from years and years and years ago and bring them into new controllers now, or new gameplay mechanics, or anything really.
Yep.
Nintendo is really in tune with their history.
Yep. It's also worth noting, if you're keeping track at home, this is really Nintendo's only 32-bit system.
Yeah.
They kind of jumped from the 16-bit Super Nintendo to the 64-bit N64, and this is considered their only 32-bit system. Again, these were the kind of things that we analyzed when we were kids, and
instead of talking about teraflops,
as you grow older, at least for me, I've realized that like 16-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit is like, are the games good? Is the controller comfortable? Is there a good library? Is the system reliable? Like, you worry about those things more than what the bit depth is of the processor. All right, moving on to probably one of the most noteworthy consoles of the 90s, and at least recently it feels like one of the most beloved consoles is the Nintendo 64.
Party boy.
I guess Nintendo's last cartridge-based system until the Switch.
I guess so. If you want to consider the Switch a cartridge,
or the handheld systems. I mean, I guess we're getting
it's
a little too technical, but the N64, for me at least, was that was the first 3D, truly like 3D console that I played, and I think a lot of people played.
Yes.
I'll never forget just the incredible feeling of freedom playing Mario 64 for the first time and just walking in all directions, and that feeling of it feeling natural and exciting and fluid. And you go back and play Mario 64 now, and like it's still good and it's still a beloved game, but having played so many other 3D games now, I don't get that same effect that I did the first time I played it.
It's something that I think the industry has kind of learned from, right? The N64 taught a lot of lessons on how a 3D game should operate and how a 3D game should perform, and Super Mario 64, Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, games like that really showed off what 3D gaming could do, especially taking two franchises that were so ingrained in the 2D space and moving them into 3D. As you can see, Nintendo included, I remember seeing this for the first time, Nintendo included a analog stick, which is it has its problems. This analog stick has its problems.
Yep.
Let's not beat around the bush here. But this was a very, very novel concept back in the mid-90s. In 1996, when the N64 came out, I remember looking at magazine articles about the Ultra 64 for about a year or so before the N64 came out, and said they put a joystick on the controller. This is ridiculous.
Yeah,
and it
just
was.
the whole form factor of that controller. I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but the Nintendo sent out a VHS tape, kind of promoting
I remember all those.
The N64, and they had a big picture of the controller on it, and I'll never forget the first time I saw that. I'm like, that's the controller? Like, that is so cool and so different than what Nintendo was doing. And yeah, very, very indicative of the 90s.
Even this transparent plastic.
Transparent plastic.
I mean, this is like 90s as it can get. Everyone had a phone that looked like this, or a Game Boy, or an N64 controller.
It's cutting edge.
It was
cool.
so 90s cool, and
there really was like a line in the sand between like early 90s and late 90s.
Oh yeah.
Things just started looking different, and they were trying to be more sophisticated and edgy and that kind of thing. And I think the N64 is like definitely a part of that, because Nintendo's whole tone kind of shifted from, kind of those, pretty storytelling games to more like action-oriented games with the N64.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that the N64 was a console built around sit on the couch, put the game in, and play right away. No worry about story or any of that stuff. Just plug your controllers in and start playing. And you see that in Super Mario 64. You see it in Mario Kart. You see it in Mario Party. You see it in so many games on the N64. And the N64, from my knowledge, is the first console to have 4 controller ports on the front of the console without having to buy a separate multi-tap. So when you're looking at the N64 in magazines in 1994 and 1995, and you see 4 controller ports on the front, it's earth-shattering, because you're like, wait a second, what games are going to have 4-player simultaneous multiplayer? And that's what the N64 kind of became known for, which is why I referred to it as the party boy. Because if you had a sleepover or slumber party in the late 90s, N64 was played the entire time, whether you were playing Mario Kart or Mario Kart Battle Mode, Mario Party, GoldenEye, Smash Brothers, Bomberman 64, F-Zero, F-Zero X, right? F-Zero X.
Yep.
The N64 was a console about couch multiplayer, playing with your friends, and it's really something that Nintendo has kind of carried into the modern era. The console is very light on RPGs. The console is very light on games that are too overly technical for someone to just not sit down and play right away.
Yeah, I think Nintendo consciously knew that even back then, the 64-bit graphics were new and exciting, but we knew they didn't look great. We still knew that they were blocky, basic, polygonal blocks with very kind of low-res textures kind of mapped on them. We knew what it was, but it didn't matter because the games were fun, right?
Yeah.
They were fun to play with your friends. So Nintendo kind of had actively kind of sacrificed the aesthetics for fun factor.
Yeah.
And it really worked. I mean, some of my best childhood memories are playing multiplayer, Bomberman for hours, multiplayer Smash Brothers for hours, just like, it really, for that reason, yeah, there weren't as many single player games or RPGs where you'd get, you know, emotionally invested in the game like you would with, say, Super Nintendo RPGs. But it was just a different approach to the types of games that they were making. On the technical side, they really didn't do too many upgrades for the N64. The major upgrade that came out was known as the Jumper Pack, and I think this was pure marketing on the expansion pack. Was I think this was pure marketing on Nintendo's part. They put this port right in the front of the console, gave you super easy access to get to it, and this is basically a port where you can upgrade the RAM in the system to play some of the later games like Donkey Kong Country. And I think Nintendo had kind of decided ahead of time, hey, we're gonna at some point launch a RAM expansion and make you have to buy it for a really like popular game.
I got mine with Donkey Kong 64, but it also was necessary to play Majora's Mask, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and it also enhanced some of the older games that a lot of times you turn on a game, if you had the expansion pack in, it would say expansion pack detected, so you'd be able to play certain games with it. But at this time, Nintendo really didn't have any third-party support, or had very, very little third-party support for the N64. So most of the games on the N64 were either first-party Nintendo games, or I guess second-party Rare games. So this is where Rareware really came into their own. They obviously created Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong Country 2, Donkey Kong Country 3 on the Super Nintendo. But when you get into the N64, Rare was a company that stood out as creating some really great 3D platformer games that were able to compete with what Nintendo was doing. Games like Banjo-Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day, but they also made great games like Blast Corps.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
And GoldenEye was a big Rare hit. So Rare and Nintendo together really were the backbone of what the N64 was trying to do.
Yeah, for all the publishers that left Nintendo to work on the PlayStation, you know, the fact that Nintendo had Rare around to make some of the best N64 games, you know, they that really worked out well, and they established so many good franchises right then and there.
Yeah, no, really, really great stuff. And in Japan, there was an expansion for the N64 disk drive, which was a disk drive that would sit under the N64, and you could play some games that they created specifically for the disk drive. One of the most memorable ones is an expansion for F-Zero X, which is the N64 version of F-Zero, and it gives you a track editor and some really great stuff. Not a lot of games out for the N64 DD, but if you can get your hands on one, or if you can try to find some time to play it.
Yeah, it is kind of a shame that the N64 disk drive didn't get more exposure, and it never got released in the United States. It's an interesting idea. I've seen one, I've played with one, and it just seems like it didn't really add that much that the regular console couldn't do, and I think that's why it didn't really take off, and Nintendo kind of didn't really push it.
Some of the mods with the N64 that I could think of mostly come with the controller. The controller is definitely the one part of the console that breaks the most. So there are a lot of modifications that you can do for the controller, replacing the analog stick, or a lot of companies have made some really great third-party sticks, third-party controllers that allow you to play more similarly to a GameCube. One game in particular, Mario Party, was notorious for destroying both your hand and the analog stick with a very silly game where you had to ride a bike so a ghost wouldn't hurt you. So, yes, that's Mario Party. That's just it in a nutshell. Just do this forever, break your hand, cut it open, form a giant blister, and you're happy about it, though.
Wasn't there that wind-up bird too in the item shop? You got to get the bird to fly across the store. You got to rotate the stick and destroy your hands.
Yeah, but
the controller too is unique in that it actually has a port on the back.
Yeah.
And Nintendo made pretty good use of this port. This is where you would plug in your memory cards
or your Rumble Pack
to save the game. Star Fox 64 introduced the Rumble Pack, which would make the controller vibrate. And also, Pokemon Stadium introduced the Transfer Pack, which let you actually plug in your Game Boy cartridge into the controller and transfer your Pokemon over to Pokemon Stadium.
And I think in Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, you can actually use that conversion pack, or whatever, what was it called? The what pack?
The Transfer Pack.
Yeah, the Transfer Pack. You could use the Transfer Pack to actually play Pokemon Red or Blue on your TV in the similar way to playing Pokemon Red or Blue on a Super Game Boy. You would get the same layout. And I will be very upset with myself if I didn't also mention some of the best wrestling games of all time.
Oh yeah.
Were released on the N64. Aki, who made 4 wrestling games, 2 with WCW and 2 with WWF before it was WWE, and those games are amazing and make great use of the 4-player multiplayer.
It's definitely true. I wasn't into wrestling as a kid, and I still really have never gotten into wrestling, but my friends had those wrestling games for the N64, and man, they were fun. Like, I had no idea what was going on, but again, they were just still fun to play. It didn't really matter what the game was or how it looked. Like, those multiplayer games were just so fun, and that's what the N64, you know, for me ended up being all about.
It's the fun machine.
To round it out, we got to talk about the 3DO. We don't have a 3DO with us, though we do have one in our archives. The 3DO was marketed also as an interactive player. It was a CD-based system. Again, another obscure console that just didn't really kind of break through. Video games has always been dominated by such major brands, you know, Nintendo, Sega, and Sony. So for like a new console to break through, it really had to market hard. And as I never really heard of the 3DO as a kid. I don't know about you, but I had no idea it was on sale. It really wasn't until later in life that I realized that it was a thing.
Yeah.
But the 3DO was a system that had very low licensing fees. They were trying to get third-party developers on board to create games for it. There are some pretty decent 3DO games, but a lot of 3DO games ended up just being ports from PC games. There wasn't too many exclusive games for it. There really wasn't much of a reason, you know, to get one. I mean, a lot of the games that were out were available on PC or other systems. A lot of the games that were on the PlayStation, you know, ended up being on 3DO. Probably one of the most famous games that got its start on 3DO was Gex the Gecko, which eventually made its way over to PlayStation as well. So again, it just didn't have much in terms of you know, exclusive content or reasons for people to buy it.
It did famously receive the first console port of Super Street Fighter 2, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which is a great version of that game. But once, like Brendan said, it's a lot of PC ports and a lot of stuff that ended up on other systems. It's just it's an important part of video game history. It's just a fairly obscure system.
So that's going to round it out for the 5th generation. Stay tuned as we go through the 6th generation on UPLINK TV, and we will continue our video game history series shortly.